Well, today I'll be doing Washington, and if you do like Washington, this I'm gonna go ahead and tell you is probably not gonna be a very fun video for you because I know what Washington was great last year, one of the best teams they've ever had, and this is nothing against Washington, but they're gonna be terrible this year. And I know a lot of their success came from Michael Penix and those wide receivers that they had. But another big loss for them, to me, is their head coach, Kalen DeBoer. He was a really good head coach, and there were some games last year that, if it hadn't have been for his great coaching, they no doubt would have lost. And they bring in the head coach from Arizona. His name is Jedd Fisch, and he was the head coach there for 3 years, and that's his only experience as a head coach. And he did build up Arizona, but it did take him the full 3 years to do it. His first year there was horrible. They went 1-11, and then the second year was still bad, but it was a lot better, going 5-7. And then in year three, which was last season, they had the good year, going 10-3. But you do have to remember that he only has one good season so far as a head coach. Now, I'm not saying he's going to be bad or that he's going to be good, but you also do have to remember that he does have a losing record overall as a head coach. And Washington's recruiting has not been great. They ranked 47 in recruiting this year, and they return only 36% of their production from last season, which ranks 130, which is really bad. Uh, so I'm going to talk some about the roster, and then I'll go through their schedule game by game and give you a predicted winner and loser for each game. So starting on the offensive side at quarterback, they bring in Will Rogers from Mississippi State, and I'm not that high on him. I don't think he's actually a great quarterback. I know he set records there for passing yards and completions and touchdown passes. And he had two huge years there, putting up huge numbers. But you do have to remember that those years were when Mike Leach was their coach at running the air raid offense, where they were throwing it like 50 to 60 times a game. So I think a lot of his success had to do with that. And his average yards per throw has never been great. And when Mike Leach died and Mississippi State changed up their offense last season to a much more balanced offense, Will Rogers didn't look good at all. He wasn't even uh, average, I don't really think. Now, a lot of Washington, with how successful they're going to be this year, I think is going to depend on him. If he is able to be like he was when they were doing the air raid at Mississippi State, Washington could still have a pretty good year. Still not anywhere close to what they were last year, but if he struggles like I think he's going to, they're gonna have a bad season this year. And Washington's offense is not going to be anything close to the air raid this year. They're going to be balanced, and they're not going to be great at either thing, running or passing, in my opinion. So at the running back position, they weren't great running the football last year, and they do lose their only good running back, Dylan Johnson, going pro. He was really good uh, last year, but other than him, they didn't have any depth. And they do bring in a really good running back from Arizona, who was one of the Pac-12's best running backs last season, Kevin Coleman, who had last year 871 yards on 128 carries and 5 touchdowns, averaging 6.8 yards a carry, and had 2 games of over 100 rushing yards. But depth to help him out is still going to be very questionable for them, I think. But overall, I think they'll probably be about the same running the ball this year. Will Rogers can't run; he's just a pocket passer. But Michael Penix was the same way. So then at wide receiver, they're not going to be anywhere close to where they were last year. Here, they lose everybody. They lose all starting three wide receivers. Roma Dunse, Jalen McMillan, and Jalen Polk all off to the NFL. And they also lose Jeremy Bernard, who was a good wide receiver that was going to get more playing time this year, but he went with Kalen DeBoer to Alabama. Now, they do bring in a good wide receiver from California. His name is Jeremiah Hunter, who had in 24 games there 122 catches and 1,668 yards and 12 touchdowns, averaging 13.7 a catch. Now, I know he is good, and this is nothing against him, but just having him compared to having all of those NFL wide receivers that they had last year is going to be like nothing. Because they don't have anyone else other than him that is proven at the wide receiver position. And then on the offensive line, they lose all 5 stars from the best offensive line in the country last year that just allowed 12 sacks all season. And they don't have hardly any experience there this year, and they aren't real talented there. So I actually think they're going to struggle on the offensive line this year, and that's going to make their offense struggle. Uh, so on the defensive side, they weren't great there last year, but they were decent. They ranked 54 of 130 something in points allowed per game. Uh, but their defense this year, I think, is probably going to be below average. So on the defensive line, I think they're going to struggle here. They weren't great last year, but they don't have any starters returning there, and they haven't brought in any great transfers either. And uh, the linebacker, this is going to be, I think, the biggest strength of Washington's team this year is the linebacker position. They are good here. They return Alfonso Kupatala, who has in 27 games 140 tackles and 4.5 sacks and a fumble recovery and an interception. And they return Carson Bruner, who only started 1 game last year and played in all 15, and still had 86 tackles last year, and also 3 pass breakups and an interception and a forced fumble. And they bring in a really good linebacker from San Jose State, Brayun Parham, who had 106 tackles there last season and 2.5 sacks and had 2 pass breakups and 2 fumble recoveries and a forced fumble and an interception. Uh, and then in the secondary, they were bad overall here last year, and I expect them to be about the same this year. They ranked 117 in passing yards allowed at 258.6 last year. And the problem with Washington's secondary last year was the safeties being terrible. They had good cornerbacks, and that will be the case this year again. I think they do lose their best cornerback, Muhammad, who transferred out, but they still have 2 good cornerbacks. They returned Elijah Jackson, who had last year 61 tackles and 5 pass breakups and 2 forced fumbles, and was the hero of the Sugar Bowl last year when he swatted away a pass to the end zone from Quinn Ewers. And they also added in a really good cornerback from Arizona, Ephesians Prysock, who had 64 tackles and 7 pass breakups and an interception last year. And then special teams, they do look good there. They return both specialists who did a good job for them last year. So the biggest strengths for them are going to be linebacker, cornerback, and special teams. So now, moving on to the predictions, they start the year against Weber State, which will be an easy win, and then they play Eastern Michigan, which will be another easy win. So this will be a nice start for the new coach and all the new players to get two easy games to start the season to get used to each other. But then it's about to get much harder for the rest of the season. Then they play Washington State, and this year Washington and Washington State's rosters are much closer to each other than they were last year, and Washington State still almost pulled the upset, and I could really see this one going either way. And I think this game is going to be like the Super Bowl to Washington State, not just because it's a in-state rival, but because they got left behind uh, and didn't get to join a conference, and Washington did. So I think they'll want to prove a point in this game and try really hard to win. But I still think Washington has a little bit more talent on their roster than Washington State does, and it is at Washington. So I'm going to pick them to win a really close one. And then they play Northwestern. So I know Northwestern returns a whole lot more production than Washington does from a team that did win 8 games last year. But when you compare talent with these two teams, Washington is still quite a bit ahead of Northwestern. Northwestern is like close to the bottom of the Power Four when it comes to talent, and this game is at Washington. So I'm going to pick them to win a close one. And then they play on the road at Rutgers. So Rutgers' offense is going to be as one-dimensional as it gets this year. They're not going to be able to throw, and they're going to want to run the football. And I think they'll have success doing that in this game. And Rutgers returns a lot from a pretty good defense last year. So I think they'll stop Washington from being able to do very much offensively in this game and score enough points running the football to get the win uh, over Washington, and this is a road game anyway. Mm, If it was at home, I'd probably take Washington, and then Michigan at home. So Michigan is going to want to run the football in this game, and I think they'll have success doing that on Washington. Michigan's offense, I think, is overall going to struggle to score points this season because of a weak passing attack. But Washington, I don't think will be able to do hardly anything against Michigan's defense. Michigan's defensive line will dominate Washington's offensive line in this game, and I think it'll be like a 30-7 type of win. So then they play on the road at Iowa. So if Washington could get to 20 points in this game, they could probably beat Iowa. But I don't think they're going to be able to do that. I think Iowa's defense will make it hard for Washington to even get to 10 points in this game, and they'll dominate Washington's offensive line. And Iowa won't score much because they never do, but they'll score enough to win, I think, a close one. So then they play on the road at Indiana. So Indiana's a team that I think is kind of underrated this year. They're supposed to be terrible again, but I've looked through their roster and they've really improved it from last season when they actually were terrible. And this game is on the road. And now I realize Indiana is not a tough place to play at all, but still, that's a long trip for Washington to have to make. Against a team that is, I think, going to be decent this year. And I think Indiana beats Washington in a close one. And then they play USC at home. So USC is still going to score a whole lot of points on Washington, probably even more than they did last year. And this year, Washington will probably still score some because USC's defense, I still think, is going to struggle, but Washington is not going to have the kind of offense to be able to keep up with USC this year. I think USC will win by at least 10 points. And then they play on the road at Penn State. So Penn State's defense will probably shut down Washington's offense pretty much completely. They may even force a shutout. Washington probably won't score any more than 10 in this game. And Penn State's offense, I know, has been horrible they've played against a really good defense, but when they've played against not very good defenses, they've usually scored a whole lot of points, and I think that'll happen this time. And uh, Washington will get blown out, and Penn State will run the football all over them in this game. And then they play UCLA at home. So these two teams are similar, both bringing in new coaches and a much different roster. But UCLA does return a lot more than Washington does. But I do think Washington does have a little more talent still than UCLA does. So I'm just going to take the home team in this one. So I'm going with Washington. And then to end the season, the rivalry against Oregon on the road. So I know they get an extra week to prepare for this game, but uh, I know this game being a rivalry may make it uh, somewhat competitive and keep it from being a blowout. But Oregon is just way too much better than Washington this year to lose this game. And I think they'll pull away in this game and uh, win by at least 2 touchdowns. So my final prediction for Washington is 5-7 overall and 2-7 in the conference. So I do think they'll miss a bowl game. And you can type in the comments that I hate Washington and that this time they are going back to the championship, but they're going to win it and go undefeated. But if you think that, you're just going to be in for a big disappointment. But that'll be it with this video. And thanks for watching. And I'll be back soon. And please subscribe to the channel.